The largest rescue mission in modern history. 12 kids buried alive in a flooded cave, and they all made it. This is one of 3 real stories of children who should not be alive. On the evening of August 16, 1987, Northwest Airlines Flight 255 taxied onto the runway of Detroit Metropolitan Airport. The McDonnell Douglas DC-9 was headed for Phoenix, with a scheduled stop in Santa Ana. There were 155 people on board. The sun had already dipped behind the skyline. The weather was calm, and no one imagined what would happen next. At 8:46 p.m., the aircraft began its takeoff roll. It never climbed. Just seconds after leaving the ground, the plane tilted sharply to the left, clipped a light pole, tore through the roof of a car rental building, and slammed into a roadway, exploding on impact. Out of everyone on board, passengers, crew, and even 2 people on the ground, there was only one survivor, a little girl, 4 years old. Her name was Cecelia Cichan. She had been traveling with her parents and her older brother. All 3 died in the crash. Cecelia was found still strapped into her seat, face down. The seat lodged beneath twisted wreckage and smoking debris. No one understood at first how she had survived. She was unconscious, badly burned, and surrounded by fire. A firefighter named John Theed found her while checking for survivors. He noticed something unusual, what looked like a small hand reaching out from beneath a collapsed row of seats. When he pulled back the wreckage, he saw her. She was alive. Her injuries were severe: 3rd-degree burns, a fractured skull, a broken clavicle, a shattered leg. She was rushed to the University of Michigan Hospital, where she spent nearly 2 months recovering. She underwent multiple skin grafts. Her small body was wrapped in bandages. Her face, arms, and legs would carry the scars for life. And yet, she survived. Some believe that her survival was due, in part, to her mother, who may have unbuckled her own belt in the final moments to shield Cecelia with her body. That, combined with the seat's position, may have created just enough protection to spare her from the worst of the blast and fire. Cecelia was too young to remember the impact, but her body did, and so did the world. Her photograph, small, pale, covered in medical tubing, was broadcast around the globe. People called her the Miracle Girl. Letters poured in by the thousands, toys, prayers, messages from strangers who had wept for her. But behind the headlines, there was something else. She was a child who had just lost everything. After the crash, Cecelia was adopted by her aunt and uncle. They moved her to Birmingham, Alabama, far from the media, far from the crash site. Her new family made a clear choice: to protect her, to give her privacy, to let her grow up outside the shadow of what had happened. For years, she didn't speak publicly about the accident. She went to school, she made friends, she wore long sleeves when she didn't want people to ask questions. She carried the scars, visible and invisible, quietly. But the past never really went away. As she got older, she began to ask questions about the crash, about her parents, about what it meant to be the only one. She began reading the letters people had written her as a child. Some were from survivors of other accidents. Others were from people who had simply felt connected to her story. Their words weren't just sympathy. They were reminders that she hadn't been forgotten. In her 20s, she decided to speak. In the documentary Sole Survivor, released in 2013, Cecelia told her story publicly for the first time. She talked about the burden of being called a miracle, about the guilt, the gratitude, the pressure of surviving when no one else did, about how she thought of the crash every single day, not because she remembered it, but because her body, her life, her very presence was a living echo of that night. Today she goes by Cecelia Crocker. She is married, a mother, she has a degree in art therapy, and on her wrist, just below the sleeve, she wears a small tattoo of an airplane, not to celebrate what happened, but to claim it, to mark it in her own way, on her own terms. In interviews, she's said that she doesn't want to be seen as a symbol, just as someone who lived, who kept going, who rebuilt a life out of a story that never should have been hers to carry. The crash of Flight 255 was caused by a simple oversight, a missed checklist, a silent alarm, an ordinary evening that turned into one of the deadliest aviation disasters in American history. And in the middle of it all, against every statistic, every expectation, There was a 4-year-old girl who survived. She didn't fight, she didn't choose to live. She was just there, shielded, held, saved maybe, by love in the last seconds before everything broke. Cecelia Crocker doesn't remember the crash, but she has lived with its weight her entire life. And each day, quietly, she honors those who didn't come back. Not by speaking for them, but by continuing to live in their place. If these stories move you, know that there are others just as extraordinary, like Julianne Koepska, the girl who fell from the sky and walked alone through the Amazon, or the 4 siblings who survived 40 days in the Colombian jungle after a plane crash in 2023. If you want to hear more about children who defied nature, death, and silence, you can find them here in the other episodes of this series. And if you haven't yet, consider subscribing.
Yeah, best you can.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
How many of you? 13.
Yeah, 13.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
17 days underground. It was supposed to be a brief adventure, a detour after football practice. Just a handful of boys, 12 of them, aged 11 to 16, and their young coach, Ekapol. The sky was heavy, as it always is in the north of Thailand in late June, but the rain hadn't started yet, and the Tham Luang cave wasn't new to them. They'd been inside before. They knew the first tunnels, just far enough to reach a rock wall where the team liked to sign their names. They brought no food, no equipment, a few flashlights, water bottles. No one thought they'd need more. They left their bicycles in a row at the entrance, slipped off their shoes, and stepped into the mountain. And then the mountain closed behind them. While they explored the early corridors, the rain began to fall, high in the hills above the cave, where no one could see. It fell hard, fast, and found its way underground. The cave flooded not from the entrance, but from within. The water rose behind them, silently, submerging their path back. They turned and found nothing but a wall of dark, cold water. They moved deeper into the cave, forced into its narrowest veins, searching for higher ground. They climbed for hours, barefoot, soaked, disoriented, until they found a ledge barely above the waterline, a strip of rock surrounded by blackness. That's where they stopped, where they waited. No one knew where they were, and they could not be found. The search began with locals and rangers. It expanded quickly. Thai Navy SEALs arrived, then international teams, British cave divers, American engineers, Australian doctors. The cave's entrance became a village of tarps and equipment, of maps and calculations, of hope measured in oxygen percentages and flood forecasts. Over 10,000 people would take part in the operation. But for the first 9 days, no one made it far enough inside. The cave was flooded, the passages narrow, visibility near zero. Divers were forced to crawl underwater, their heads scraping the ceiling, their oxygen tanks removed to squeeze through. Every inch forward was a risk. Every decision, oxygen or no oxygen, go or wait, meant life or death. On July 2nd, 2 British divers emerged into a partially dry chamber 4 kilometers deep. And there, sitting quietly on the rock, were the 13 they had come to find. Thin, mud-streaked, smiling. Every single one of them was alive. That video of 12 boys blinking into torchlight, asking what day it was, traveled the world in hours. But for the divers, there was no time to celebrate. The hard part was just beginning. The cave was still flooding. The boys were still trapped. And now they had to be brought out, alive, through 4 kilometers of submerged, jagged, pitch-black cave. Waiting wasn't an option. Oxygen levels were dropping rapidly in the chamber. The boys were already malnourished, cold, weakened, and more rain was coming. If they didn't act soon, the mountain would take them back. Teaching the boys to dive was considered, but quickly ruled out. Most of them couldn't even swim. The dive route wasn't a straight line. It was a jagged crawl through water, the color of coffee, with silt so thick it erased sight in seconds. One passage narrowed to just 38 centimeters wide. Another required a vertical descent through a muddy shaft, followed by an upward push through a choke point. At several turns, the divers had to remove their tanks and drag them behind. And yet, somehow, they devised a plan. Each boy would be sedated. An anesthesiologist, Richard Harris, was brought in from Australia. He had to calculate the exact dosage that would keep each child unconscious, but breathing through the multi-hour journey underwater. One mistake, one leak in a mask, and the child could drown silently, unnoticed in the blackness. Each boy was dressed in a wetsuit, fitted with a full-face oxygen mask, and strapped to a stretcher. Divers would guide them one by one through the flooded passages. One diver would lead, holding the stretcher. Another would follow, monitoring the mask, the child's body, his breathing, every signal of danger. The diver in front could not look back. The one behind had to watch for signs of life, rising bubbles, tiny movements, anything. Each trip out of the cave took nearly 5 hours. The first 4 boys were evacuated on July 8th. In complete silence, each child was moved from chamber to chamber, diver to diver, air tank to air tank. At each transition point, divers checked the boys' pulses, adjusted the masks, kept them asleep. In one section, where the cave narrowed to a crawl space, the child's body had to be turned sideways and pushed through by hand. At another, they had to be lifted vertically up a shaft, blindly while still unconscious. The divers were trained for worst-case scenarios, but no one had ever attempted anything like this. It was not a rescue. It was an experiment with 13 lives. On July 9th, 4 more boys were brought out the same way. Then finally, on July 10th, the last 4 children and their coach were carried through the tunnels. 17 days after they had entered, every one of them was out, alive. The world erupted in relief. But behind the celebration were the quiet details. The diver who lost consciousness underwater, but was revived. The team who spent days submerged, guiding strangers through a mountain with no light. The rescue that cost the life of Saman Kunan, the former Navy SEAL who suffocated while delivering oxygen tanks. And the silent grief of his widow who stood at the cave mouth while the boys were lifted out, knowing her husband had not returned. When the boys were released from hospital, they bowed together before a portrait of Saman. Some wept, others held hands. None of them had asked to be part of this story. They were children, caught by the earth, hidden in its lungs for over 2 weeks. But they emerged not as survivors of a freak event, but as the center of one of the most improbable rescues in history. Today they are grown. Some play football again. One trains as a Navy SEAL. They've spoken of the cold, the silence, the endless hours. They've recalled hearing the splash of divers long before seeing light. They've described the moment a voice called out in English. And for the first time in 9 days, they knew they hadn't been forgotten. The cave is silent now. Its entrance is closed to the public. But deep inside, a small ledge of rock remains, where 13 people, trapped in total darkness, waited with nothing but patience, prayer, and each other. In 1969, a 17-year-old boy named Armando Socarrás Ramirez made a choice that defied both reason and survival. It wasn't a decision taken out of recklessness, nor driven by heroism. It was the kind of choice one makes when no doors are left open, when hope itself becomes an act of quiet desperation. That year, in the thick silence of Castro's Cuba, Armando chose to flee, not by sea, not by bribery or forged documents, but by hiding in the unpressurized, unheated wheel well of a commercial jet bound for Madrid. He had no coat, no oxygen supply, no plan beyond the blind belief that escape was still possible. He climbed inside the landing gear of a Douglas DC-8 just moments before takeoff, and hoped for the best. For weeks leading up to that night, Armando and his closest friend Jorge had studied the airport's layout and movement schedules. They watched the security patrols, memorized the long-haul departures, and observed which flights left for Europe. Both boys were too young to fully grasp the science of what they were attempting. The lack of oxygen at high altitude, the body's intolerance to extreme cold, the mechanical risks of hiding inside a plane's undercarriage. But they understood that the odds were against them, and that staying in Cuba would eventually kill something inside them anyway. On the night of their escape, under cover of darkness, they slipped through the perimeter fence at Havana Airport and sprinted across the tarmac toward a DC-8 already in motion. Time was against them. The plane was rolling. They managed to reach the landing gear as it taxied toward the runway. Armando climbed first, pulling himself into the narrow, metallic cavity. Jorge was just behind him when something gave way. A momentary slip, a lost grip, a sudden drop. Jorge fell to the ground and was immediately arrested by security forces. Armando, unaware of what had happened to his friend, remained hidden in the belly of the aircraft. A few seconds later, the plane lifted off the ground, wheels retracting, doors sealing shut. The escape had begun. The space he had crawled into was no more than a narrow compartment lined with cold metal and rotating machinery. With the landing gear now secured, the space around him turned into a steel coffin. There was no heating, no pressure regulation, and no light. The noise from the engines roared through the structure, a violent, continuous vibration that made thought nearly impossible. The outside temperature, at cruising altitude, hovered around -43 degrees Celsius. The air contained barely a third of the oxygen needed to maintain consciousness. Within minutes, Armando's breath slowed. His body began to tremble uncontrollably. The cold crept through his limbs, numbing his fingers first, then his legs, then the rest of his body. At some point over the Atlantic, Armando lost consciousness. Medical experts would later suggest that he had entered a state of poikilothermia, a rare physiological response in which the body, exposed to extreme cold and hypoxia, reduces its core activity to the bare minimum, a kind of human hibernation. It was not a defense mechanism he could have consciously activated, nor something he would have survived under different conditions. But in that moment, pressed between steel walls and hydraulic pipes, his body shut down just enough to keep him alive. The flight lasted more than 8 hours. When the aircraft touched down at Madrid-Barajas Airport, the landing gear lowered and the compartment opened. A human form, limp and covered in frost, dropped from the undercarriage and hit the tarmac. Airport workers rushed to the scene, certain they were looking at a corpse. His skin had turned blue, his shirt frozen stiff against his chest. His breathing, if it existed at all, was imperceptible. And yet, something moved. Someone leaned closer and saw it. A slight twitch, maybe a flicker of the eye, maybe the faintest trace of breath. Whatever it was enough. An ambulance was called. The boy was rushed to the nearest hospital. The doctors who received him nicknamed him El Cubito de Hielo, the little ice cube. At first, they believed he would not survive the night. His body temperature was dangerously low, his internal organs barely functional. He was unresponsive, temporarily deaf, severely frostbitten, and unconscious. But over the following days, his condition began to improve. Against all odds, his hearing returned. The tissue damage, though severe, did not require amputation. His organs began to function normally again. He emerged from the coma, and after 52 days in the hospital, Armando Socarrás walked out of the building on his own legs. Alive, intact, awake. The story, unsurprisingly, made headlines across the world. Reader's Digest, the BBC, Spanish and American newspapers, everyone wanted to speak to the boy who had survived the coldest part of the sky. And yet, when asked to recount the journey, Armando never turned it into a spectacle. He didn't speak of miracles or superhuman strength. Instead, he described what it was like to feel his breath vanish in the cold, what it meant to lose sensation in his limbs, to black out while clinging to a narrow hope, unsure whether the next sound he would hear would be freedom or the grinding death of a hydraulic press. He said he had thought of his family, of his girlfriend, of Cuba, of the life he had left behind, and the one he might never live to see. He said the pain came and went, and then the cold took everything. After recovering, he was granted asylum in the United States. He never sought the spotlight. He moved on quietly, building a life far from cameras and headlines. He worked as a driver, then trained as a firefighter. He volunteered as a paramedic, helping strangers survive the impossible, just as strangers had helped him. When he speaks of his escape today, he does so without embellishment. He doesn't call himself brave, he calls himself lucky. He knows he should not have survived, that his decision was reckless, perhaps even suicidal. But in a world where so many die trying to escape the cages they were born into, the fact that he lived, that he endured the cold, the darkness, the silence at 29,000 feet, is not just a miracle. It is a reminder of what people are willing to risk when all other doors are closed. At 17, Armando Socarrás climbed into the sky, and somehow, against reason, against physics, he came down alive. They weren't trained, they weren't prepared, And they certainly weren't supposed to make it. Yet against fire, ice, water, against every law of probability, they did. Cecelia, who woke up alone in the wreckage. Armando, who crossed an ocean unconscious, frozen in the sky. And the 12 boys of Tham Luang who waited for 17 days in the dark without ever giving up. None of them asked to become symbols of survival, but their stories remind us of one thing. Sometimes, the strongest kind of resilience comes in the smallest bodies.